So governments and companies have always sought to understand their audience, whether they are citizens or customers. Often, this is in our best interest to understand what we want and need and to design better products and services for us. Sometimes, however, it may be against our best interest, or the approach taken may somehow violate civil liberties. So recently, there's been a lot of controversy around the organized surveillance of people. So what is so special about what is happening now, and why is it so controversial? So the internet has created new ways of observing human behavior, consumption, communication, interests, and beliefs. Data science, broadly speaking, refers to the new methods of collecting, analyzing, and using this data from digital interactions. So the increasing digitalization of our world and its industries has allowed organizations to collect more data about more of our lives than ever before. But I think there are some basic questions that we should ask. So, what do we collect? How do we use it? And why do we do it? And then I think there are some more complex ethical questions that we should ask, such as what shouldn't we collect? How shouldn't we use it? And who should decide what is okay and what is not? So in order to approach these questions, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do at The Guardian, and then about why organizations take this kind of approach, and finally take you through 3 case studies where organizations have got into trouble over their data practices. So I hope that this will help us understand why it's important, but also really difficult to establish ethical data practices, and perhaps also where responsibility might lie and how we can take ownership of our privacy. So what do we do at The Guardian? We develop systems to collect data about our whole digital business, from the creation of content by our journalists through to the consumption of that content by our audience. We collect data about every page view from every person. We don't know who you are. To us, you're just an anonymous string of letters and numbers, but we do know that you're a person. This is a person. Each of these bubbles represents a key word in our content, and each bubble is sized by its relative popularity. So we can see this person is particularly interested in football, which are the light blue bubbles, and they follow the Premier League, and they probably support Manchester United. We can see that they also have a healthy interest in our life and style section, which are the light green bubbles. And this person's probably a foodie. They read a lot about restaurants, chefs, and food. So collectively, people form an audience. So this is a segment of our audience's interests at a given moment in time. So obviously, there's a huge number of interests here, and it's a really complex picture. So let's just zoom into a bit. So we can start to see more nuanced interests coming out and the relationships between these things. So in the middle there's a bubble labeled Tony Blair. So he's our former Prime Minister. And we can see that times have changed. And to our audience, Tony Blair is less interesting now than Nick Clegg, the leader of Liberal Democrats. In turn, Nick Clegg appears to be a little bit less interesting than Nigel Farage, perhaps surprisingly. But that said, all of these politicians appear to be less popular than natural disasters down here on the right-hand side. So if it says something about our audience or British politics in general. So we use this information to understand what our audience is reading and what they want to read more about. We build models of our audience, our content, and our products, and how these interact and change over time. So why do we do this? Well, there's many reasons, so I'm just going to focus on one, and that's the effect that it can have. I'm going to talk about an example from Google. Now, Google were interested in understanding the effect of the color of their advertising buttons. Now, this may sound really trivial, but I'm going to explain why it's not. So they designed an experiment to test a number of different colors, mostly shades of blue, and this became known as the 50 Shades of Blue experiment. And they found that in particular, one shade of blue was more effective at driving clicks on their ads than any other. Now, the size of this effect was an increase of 0.00055% of the click-through rate, so the chance that you click on an item. So this number is absolutely minuscule, but it's all about economies of scale. Google see 2 billion searches a day. That's 730 billion searches a year. So even with this tiny number, Google saw an additional 4 million clicks. And with an average cost per click for their high-end inventory of about $55, they were able to generate an additional $200 million of revenue, all from changing the color of a button. So when your audience is this huge, tiny changes can have a massive impact. So this takes me to my first case study. This is a really early story of data science in action. It revolves around a large US supermarket who wanted to drive up their sales by targeting a particular consumer group, new parents. Now, having a baby is a time of great change and new habits, and also a massive increase in expenditure on everyday goods. However, in order to win over your new customers, you need to market to them before they have their new baby. Afterwards, they're just too exhausted and too busy to change something as simple as where they buy their products from. Also, you need to reach them before your competitors do. So in other words, before it's public knowledge. So what did they do? They set about trying to predict when their customers were pregnant. Now, it turns out that it's not that difficult to predict pregnancy from purchasing behavior. You get a fairly good signal when a 23-year-old female begins to buy unscented lotion, cocoa butter, magnesium, and zinc. So the company identified an inventory of about 25 items that, when analyzed together, could be used to give the customers a pregnancy score. And now they got so good at this that they were able to estimate their customers' due date to within 2 weeks. Now, they took a very frank and specific approach to marketing to these customers, so that when you're approaching, say, your second trimester, they would send you adverts about prenatal vitamins or maternity clothes. And then when your due date was approaching, they would switch and send you adverts about your baby clothes or nappies. So it didn't take very long for customers to realize, hang on a second, this company firstly knows that I'm pregnant, and secondly, it knows exactly what stage of pregnancy I'm in. So, I think, needless to say, this creeped out many of their customers. And there was one particular story that reached the media at the time. So a man entered one of their stores in Minneapolis, and he was furious. And the reason he was so angry was because the company had been sending his daughter adverts about baby products and maternity products. And his daughter was in high school, so he was confused as to why they were sending this information to someone who was so young. I think we can all see where this is going. It turned out that the daughter was in fact pregnant, and she just hadn't told her father yet. So I think this story helps illustrate how companies doing this kind of work can create an ethical quandary. So I think the key ethical issue here is that the company have been able to deduce intimate and personal knowledge about their customers. This knowledge hadn't been volunteered by them in any way, and they acted on it in quite a public manner. I think, frankly, the only other place they could have got this information from is the person's medical records in terms of their pregnancy and their due date. And so I think certain types of information, perhaps that relates to health states, should be considered privileged and private. So let's fast forward to the present. My next case study revolves around a large social network. Now, this company got into a lot of trouble back in June this year when they ran an experiment on nearly 700,000 of their users without telling them. So the company was interested to know whether emotions were contagious across their social network. So they developed an experiment to test this, and it did so by hiding certain types of information from their users' content streams. So half of the people would see less positive content, and the other half of the people would see less negative content. The idea was that this would create an emotional bias in the content they were consuming, and that this emotional bias would transfer across into their mood. And finally, they could measure this change in mood by analyzing the user's own posts during the time of the study. So they found exactly what they predicted. People who saw fewer negative pieces of content were more likely to publish positive items, and people who saw fewer positive items were more likely to post negative content. However, when this study became public knowledge, when it's published in a scientific journal, there was a backlash from their users, some of who felt that the approach that had been taken was an abuse of their rights. Now, the company responded by saying that the research was consistent with their data use policy, to which all users consent when they join the platform, and that this constituted informed consent for the research. Now, it turned out this just wasn't true. The experiment was run 4 months prior to the inclusion of the word research in their data use policy. So they've been rather naughty here, I think. Now, this study I found absolutely fascinating. It's exactly the kind of experiment that I wanted to run when I was an undergraduate in psychology, in terms of the scale and the technology used here. But the fact is, back then, even when we were running experiments on maybe 100 people in a university environment, we had to go through an enormous ethical protocol. You know, we wrote reports and sent these off to independent ethical bodies. So I think really that the issue here is that participants did not make an active decision to participate, and that in order to have done so, they needed to be more explicitly informed of the experimental environment. Frankly, when a company is able to toy with the emotions of nearly 1 million people at the flick of a button, I think we need to ask ourselves, have we crossed a line somewhere? So this brings me on to my final case study. I couldn't leave today without talking about this guy. This is obviously Edward Snowden, the whistleblower who leaked secret documents about government surveillance programs. These documents detailed the collection of, frankly, as much data about as many people as possible. So these programs were born out of the fallout from 9/11. The US government and others were determined to put a stop to future acts of organized terror. And they decided that in order to do so, it was essential to collect vast amounts of personal information about global citizens. So I'm going to try and explain very briefly the philosophy behind this unlimited data capture approach. Now, it's very difficult to spot a terrorist, particularly before they've committed an act of terror. The only way to do so is to collect a large number of clues to anticipate that they're going to commit a crime or an act of terror. Now, we all leave a digital trail as we navigate through the web, like footprints. So the idea was that terrorists would leave clues along the way. However, you're left in a catch-22 situation. The only way to catch the terrorist is to collect all the clues. And the only way to collect all the clues is to collect all of the footprints, including those of innocent people. So this is exactly what they did. Now, when these documents became public knowledge, there was a huge backlash from the public who felt that these approaches were too broad stroke and that they violated civil liberties in the way that they operated. So perhaps the best known system that came out of these documents is PRISM. Now, PRISM is a tool for collecting data. Essentially, it allows full backdoor access to some of the largest internet and communications companies on US soil. Now, interestingly, many of these companies have come forward and publicly stated that they did not cooperate with the program to the level detailed in the documents, suggesting that the government was in fact hacking them. Now, PRISM allowed for the collection of an enormous amount of data about people from all over the world. But that data is not very useful on its own. So they developed another tool known as XKeyscore. Now, XKeyscore is essentially the search engine for this data. It allows a government operative to enter a query about a person, so perhaps a phone number or an email. And XKeyscore would then search through this enormous trove of data collected by PRISM and join together anything that was highly associated with it. So, for example, if they had your phone number, they can get, obviously, your phone history, who you've spoken to, and when. If it's a smartphone, they can get your GPS history and build a trail of where you've been over time. And with these two things, they can work out if you've met anybody that you've phoned by overlapping your GPS data and their GPS data and seeing if you've been in the same place at the same time. If your bank card is registered on your phone, which it probably is, they can get your bank history, so what you've purchased, when and where. And then if you've used that card on your computer, they can get your computer activity, so your search history what you've downloaded and your personal communications, such as your emails. So they're able to build an incredibly rich and detailed description of an individual person and their activities, both online and in the real world. So I think that the key ethical issue here is the mass and secretive surveillance of innocent people that allows for a rich and intimate description of an individual person and their activities. So I think that through these case studies, we've identified 3 main ethical red flags. Firstly, the use of intimate and personal information without that being volunteered by the person. I don't think this applies to all personal information, but particular types, such as health data, should be privileged and private. I think secondly, the manipulation of a person's mental or bodily states without that person being a willing participant. So I don't think we're guinea pigs of corporations to do with what as they will. And thirdly, the mass and secret surveillance of innocent people without due democratic process. So I don't believe that there should be no surveillance, but I think that this needs to be discussed in a proper democratic platform to establish the line between what is right and what is wrong. So I think this comes down to 3 core principles: a right to privacy of personal and sensitive information, a right to privacy of yourself, so your body and your mind, and a right to freedom from unlimited surveillance. So what can we do? Firstly, we can demand that our governments regulate properly through proper democratic discourse. Secondly, we can build regulation into the fabric of the internet, so a technological change where privacy is assumed rather than something we opt into. And thirdly, we can take ownership and responsibility for our privacy ourselves. So there are many ways you can increase your privacy, but we need to care, we need to educate, we need to act on these. And finally, we can encourage organizations to be more transparent around their data practices, so to increase and improve corporate and organizational responsibility. Ultimately, privacy is and should be a fundamental human right. But defining what is a violation of privacy is difficult in this modern world. So I think it's essential that we all stand up and engage with these issues in order to defend our privacy in our digital world. Thank you.